As you might gather from the wisdom lessons today, I want to talk about one of the biggest problems, maybe the most significant problem facing our nation at this time. I want to talk about money, both capital and income, and its unfair and very unequal distribution. A topic which is arguably the most important issue facing our nation today, and only one of those very important issues that was not even mentioned in 3 hours of presidential candidate debates this week. Not the environment, not the avoidance of unnecessary wars, not the military budget, and not the income disparity. And to get to what I want to say, I want to remind you of two important parts of what I suspect was a part of our shared childhoods, with rare exception of someone in the room that might have missed either one of these. The two images are, however, very far apart. The first was a very popular board game that was born in the early 1900s and marketed for most of the 20th century by Parker Brothers, called Monopoly. In those hot Kentucky summers where I grew up, before anyone had air conditioning and when daytime television was all just soap operas, the kids in my neighborhood would all gather at Mickey Huffman's house because he had a basement. And in that cool basement, we could lie on the cement floor and play Monopoly for hours. But you all know how the game is played. Everyone starts with an equal distribution of cash. Then you roll the dice and move your game piece around the board. If you land on a property that no one else has bought, you can buy it if you have enough cash. And if someone else owns it, you have to pay them rent for being on their property. It usually takes a couple of hours of combining strategy with the roll of the dice, but one player starts to rise and the others start to sink until one by one players go broke and have to drop out of the game, and one person wins, which means everyone else is broke. Now, of course, for us, the real point of playing Monopoly in the first place was so that we could hang out together and not be baked in the sun. So the winner would start going off script and loaning other players money to keep them in the game. There were outside of the board game coalitions being formed where money was passed around so that we could all just stay there. Sadly, however, that is not the way the real economy works. We are not concerned about making sure that everyone gets to stay in the game. The other image I want to call to mind, and one that might not have the same power for those of you who are much older than I am, though I turned 59 this week, so the number of people who are much older than I am is getting smaller and smaller as time goes by. But I want to invite you to think about the TV show Star Trek. It was brilliant and sometimes even prophetic for the time in which Gene Roddenberry was writing those scripts. One of the most adamant aspects of Roddenberry's view of the future was that there would be no money. No one on Star Trek got a salary. No one bought or sold anything. There was no accumulation of wealth. There was no profit motive to anything that anyone did. There was no price set on food, drink, clothes, or even living quarters. Everyone simply had everything that they needed. There was to be no currency in the Federation. Roddenberry was able to imagine a lot of things in the 1960s that did later come into existence, in which the basic necessities of life were simply provided without any need for currency. That part we haven't seen. But if you let yourself think about it, it is doable. And can you really imagine that in the future we will still have fabulously wealthy people and extremely poor people who are in danger of exposure to the elements or even of starvation? Surely in the future, we will find a way of distributing necessary items for living without having to use currency to do it. The concept of accumulated wealth based on a dollar value of property and instruments is, however, how the rich stay rich and how they keep the poor poor. Imagining a way of sharing real estate, food, resources without currency, and without hoarding is crucial to the survival of a planet that has billions of people on it. One of the most purchased but least read books over the past 2 years was the French economist Thomas Piketty's book on capital. I'm guilty as charged. I bought it. I assumed that I more or less got the point in the first 20 pages and left the other 800 pages for some other time. The indisputable fact is that we cannot resolve poverty if we allow the wealthy to hoard all of the assets. There is no solution if capital continues to be held in the hands of the 1%. It would be like trying to join a Monopoly game after your friends have already been playing for an hour. You might get the same starting cash from the bank that everyone else got, but if they've already bought all the property, all you can do is fail. There is no way to win if you join the Monopoly game an hour after it started. But that is exactly what we ask everyone to do in our economy. You tell new college graduates from poor families that they have the same chance as everyone else. But the truth is, virtually all of the winners in a capitalist economy are the ones who start out with capital. As Anatole France said, the law in its majestic equality forbids the rich and the poor to sleep under bridges, to beg in the streets, or steal bread. But of course, the people who have capital are the ones who have the influence to write the laws. They own the banks, they control consumer lending, and surprise of surprises, they write the laws and the rules in a way where they end up with all the cash. We think of Great Britain as being much more class conscious than the New World nation of the United States, and maybe that was true 2 or 3 or 4 generations ago. But if you are born poor in Great Britain, you have a 30% chance of staying poor, but a 70% chance of breaking out of poverty. In the United States, if you're born into poverty, there's a 42% chance that you'll die in poverty and live in poverty every day of your life. Nearly half of the people born into poverty never have the chance to break out. And you compare that with a socialist nation like Denmark, where 80% of the people born in poverty manage to work their way out of it. But we have a system structured where you're familiar with the saying that 90% of the law concerns property. Well, who writes the laws? The laws and the rules of banking, of real estate, of taxation are written by the people at the top of the pile. In the United States, the system is designed to keep the rich rich and to keep the poor poor. It's not always been this way. The great American middle class rose up in the years following World War II at a time when the economy was much more balanced with both personal and corporate taxes. You hear people decrying the corporate tax rate in the United States, but the truth is that no one pays that total corporate tax rate. The percentage of our federal budget that is raised by corporate taxes is less than half of what it was when I was in high school. In the years when we were playing Monopoly, the highest tax bracket on the wealthiest earners in the United States was 91%. And even with all the tax deductions and loopholes that were available even then, the wealthiest among us paid 50% of their income in taxes. In those days, the average difference between an entry-level employee and a CEO was the CEO would make as much as 50 entry-level employees. Now the rich pay approximately 10 to 15% of their income, where the middle class can pay as much as 30. And CEO pay is now on average, 350 times an entry-level employee. And the News Leader this week ran a column about some businesses where the ratio is 800 to 1. 800 to 1. I was never very inclined to eat at Chipotle, but I'll tell you, I'll never go again. I mean, the very obscenity that a person could say that they were going to take as much income as they are willing to pay 800 of their staff members. That is so obscene that it is disgusting to think of. It is true that our tax code has become horribly complex, and I hate it too. Ministers' pay is very complicated. We're paid in allowances, and so filing my taxes, even with 15 years in college, I'm not smart enough to fill out my own federal tax forms. I have to pay someone else to do it, and I find that to be very disgusting. But you have to think about who designed the tax code. Do you honestly believe that fast food workers have lobbied for all of these amendments and complications in the tax code? You don't see any McDonald's employee labor union banding together to demand special consideration for their tax posture. The tax code is complicated because it is written to serve the wealthy, and it is they who have fought for every form of favoritism imaginable until the system is so rigged that they cannot lose. As the pastor of a small church in the Ozarks, I pay more in federal taxes than General Electric. The obscenity of that should absolutely frighten us. When we were young, there was a national passion for what we called the war on poverty. But the war on poverty has become, in many ways, a war on the poor. We blame the poor for being poor, when the system is structured in such a way that they could hardly be anything else. The middle class is taught to despise the poor and to blame them for their own hardships, or to say that their hardships are caused by the recipients of whatever public assistance barely still exists. In Arizona and Florida, governors have proposed administering drug tests to all recipients of food stamps and other forms of public assistance. In Arizona, after spending millions of dollars to test 150,000 people, they found 3 people taking drugs. Can you imagine if they drug tested the legislature in Arizona? How many legislators would be found to be using drugs? The results were about the same in Florida, except that in Florida, now this would sound like a sitcom if it weren't true. The governor of Florida owns the drug testing company, so that Rick Scott literally paid himself millions of taxpayer dollars and found a fraction of 1% of welfare recipients to be using drugs. And quite frankly, if I were that poor, I'm not sure that I wouldn't use drugs. I mean, of the people who might really need some kind of adjustment to their experience of life, can we not understand why people who live in the violence and the danger of crushing poverty might need some mood-altering medication from time to time? But even though they might be the ones you would suspect of using it, they are among the least likely to use it. And even though this was so obvious, and you have social workers and sociologists telling them at the time, still millions of taxpayer dollars are wasted in order to humiliate and intimidate the poor, but there's been no impeachment, no criminal malfeasance charges, and blue-collar workers are still angry at welfare recipients as if welfare recipients are what's causing their hardships. It reminds me of KKK members who are almost universally very poor, uneducated, and low-functioning white people who believe that they've got to be superior to someone. And so they try to make themselves out to be superior to blacks, Jews, Hispanics, Catholics, and gay people, when in fact, poor whites have much more in common with poor blacks than they have ever had in common with their managers, employers, and white business owners. Conservatives who defend the system that keeps the rich on top of the economic pile constantly try to get the poor to fight with each other. Because when the poor stop fighting with each other and start to organize, there will be a redistribution of wealth. And that can happen in one of 2 ways. It can happen peacefully through the reintroduction of a fair and justly progressive tax system, or it can happen violently through revolution. I'm in favor of the peaceful method, but as a person who, because of my spirituality, is devoted to social justice, I'm willing to say to the wealthy that it has to happen. You get to choose. Will you do it by a fair and just taxation system, or would you rather have violent revolution? But it is going to have to happen. And you get to choose today which way that's going to take place, but you will not always get to choose. If I may return to the Monopoly game again, when one person wins, even they have lost because they can't keep moving their piece around the board all by themselves. I mean, if what you're looking for is friendship and a happy life, you can't put the people out of business that pay rent to you. This is what unbridled greed never seems to see, that the more that we keep transferring wealth from the lower and middle class to the top, the more the people at the top will ultimately fail. I'm going to say more about this next week, but when winning is defined as impoverishing your customers, then even the rich lose. If you destroy your customer base, you are out of business. A year ago, when Seattle decided to raise the minimum wage in their city to $15 an hour, the 1% went nearly crazy, announcing that this act of economic compassion towards the poor would result in massive layoffs and job losses that would kill the economy. But what's actually happened? You don't hear it mentioned in corporate media because the corporate media didn't want it to happen. But what actually happened is that in Seattle, unemployment in 1 year's time has gone down by 25%. And those who earn low wages obviously spend every bit of the wages that they earn. If you move from $9 an hour to $15 an hour, you're not going to establish an offshore savings account. You will take that money and go back to the restaurants and the retail stores in your area, and it has turned into a huge boon to the economy in that area, which is not being talked about because we don't want it to become popular. It does sort of smack of socialism in a way, which doesn't offend some of us as much as it does others. How hard is it to understand that if you impoverish people that they won't spend money, but if you pay them a fair wage, they will spend it? Only those blinded by an evil degree of greed can believe that they are better off if they can keep other people suffering. As Marion Edelman said, we do not have a shortage of money in America. We don't. This is a rich country. We have plenty of money. Everyone can live in a house. Everyone can eat every day. Everyone can get an education. Everyone can have the clothes that they need to wear. We do not have a shortage of money. We do have a shortage of morality, of decency, of compassion. If the church has any reason to exist at all, surely it is to increase compassion, inspiring our civilization to be more decent and to make more moral choices. What is certainly clear is that if we're hoping for some moral leadership to come to us from anything that you saw on stage in presidential debates this week, clearly that's like believing that you can get blood out of a turnip. You cannot go to where compassion is not to find compassionate leadership. Either you are the light of the world, or the world will continue to live in darkness.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Reverend Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.